So I'd like to begin this final lecture with a quote from a poem called Letters to a Young Poet by Rainer Maria Rilke. I want to beg you, as much as I can, dear sir, to be patient toward all that is unresolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves like locked rooms and like books that are written in a very foreign tongue. The point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer. So I'm going to take that last line, living into the answer, and I want to talk about what does that look like when it comes to doubt? Or how can we be the answer to our doubt? What does it mean for us to proactively redeem those dark, hidden places of questioning and uncertainty and doubt? A number of years ago, I had a chance to go to Uganda, and our church there is doing a number of different ministries and works, including a safe home for women who have been sex trafficked and gone through abuse. There's a number of schools that we're supporting. And while I was there this last trip, I met probably the most remarkable woman I've ever met in my life. Her name was Sister Rosemary. And Sister Rosemary, she lives up in Gulu, which is in the northern part of Uganda. And she has been nominated as Time Magazine's one of the top 100 most influential women in the world. She was also nominated for a Peace Prize, a Nobel Peace Prize, a number of years ago. And the reason is because a number of years ago when Joseph Kony and the LRA, they were in that area. And remember how when the LRA was growing, led by Joseph Kony, they were kidnapping children. They'd actually go into villages, kidnap these kids, and these poor kids were forced, one of their first acts was to go kill a family member, which you can imagine just how disruptive that was. And then they were forced to fight his wars. An absolutely horrific situation. Sister Rosemary, at that time, she had a school, she's living up there, and most people were fleeing, they were running away, getting out of the country, and yet she stayed. And she opened up her home as a place of refuge for kids to come and find safety in the midst of all these kidnappings. And there were tens of thousands of these child soldiers. She saw things that were unspeakable. She heard stories that would just break your heart. And so we were sitting down one evening having this meal of chicken and rice. And I've never met anyone like Sister Rosemary. She's like the most joyful person, seriously, that I've ever met. Her eyes are like sparkling and flashing. She's always smiling and grinning and has this infectious laughter, which is fascinating to me. But if you think about joy, all the stuff that she's been through, and yet I've never met a more joyful person. And so we're having this conversation and she's sharing with me some of the things that she's experienced. But I couldn't help but ask, because it was during the time I'm writing this book on doubt. And I was like, Sister Rosemary, how do you reconcile your belief in a good God with all the suffering and pain and trauma that you've experienced and seen in the life of these kids and what's happened to this whole region of Uganda? I will never forget what she said. And what she told me has forever reshaped how I view doubt and what doubt can do in our life. This is what she wrote or said. Dom, I don't have the answer to that. But I know that love is greater than hate. I know that forgiveness is stronger than bitterness. I know that kindness can heal even the most devastated heart. I've seen what hope can do, and I've devoted the rest of my life to being that hope for as many people as I can. So for Sister Rosemary, rather than letting her doubts about God win, she chose to harness her doubts for the redemption of the world. Instead of letting suffering have the last word, she devoted her life to bringing healing to the broken and wounded of the world. Instead of letting her questions about God deplete her faith, her questions actually became the fuel that motivated her faith. And that moment really changed how I view doubt. And I can't help but ask the question, what would it look like for us to do the same thing as we deal with our own doubts? What does it mean for our doubts to be redeemed in this way? Well, again, maybe you have doubts because you've seen too much hypocrisy in the church, or you've been disillusioned by the church. You've seen divisiveness or weird pastors or whatever. And you wonder, man, I don't want to be a part of this anymore. What would it look like instead of allowing bitterness to drive us from God and from community? What would it look like instead to say, you know what? I'm going to stay and be a part of the solution. I want to live out a different story where instead of hypocrisy, I want to model authenticity and grace. You see what you're doing is you're taking your doubt and you're redeeming it and saying, yeah, I'm actually struggling with this, but I want to use this doubt as an agent that's driving me deeper and deeper into a quest for more authentic, beautiful community church the way it was meant to be. Or maybe you struggle with the silence of God. This has been kind of an unfolding question that I've had in my own life. What would it look like for us, instead of letting that doubt deplete and destroy our faith, to say, what would it look like to be the voice of God to the world, to be a voice of hope and grace and justice to a world that knows nothing but cynicism and fear and despair? Or maybe you're struggling with doubts about Scripture. You look at it, and there's a lot of parts of Scripture that maybe confuse you or unsettle you or disturb you. Maybe it raises more questions than answers. What if instead of focusing on those parts that we don't understand, we actually took the parts that we did understand and say, you know what? I can live into that. I mean, Jesus said, love one another. That should keep us busy for a long time, right? Our doubts can be redeemed. Or maybe we're doubting God's goodness because we don't understand why he'd allow something as evil as human trafficking or racism or poverty. Well, what would it look like for us to push back against the enemy? And in the words of the Apostle Paul, he said, overcome evil with good. Doubt can be redeemed. If we let it, the tension of an unresolved faith can actually be the motivation for deeper faith. Now, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he said something remarkable along these lines, and he lived this out. He said, we are not to simply bandage the wounds of victims beneath the wheels of injustice. We are to drive a spoke into the wheel itself. So when injustice causes us to doubt God's presence or goodness or power, we don't simply internalize it or silently drift from him. We use that doubt to be a force for change. We drive ourselves into the wheel of injustice. We are God's hands. We are God's feet. We are God's image to a lost and lonely world. And I think this is the difference between redeemed doubt and toxic doubt. Remember earlier I talked about how doubt is essentially neutral. It's all dependent on what you do with it. On one side you have faith. On the other side you have unbelief. Sometimes doubt can become toxic. Again, Genesis 3, Satan uses doubt in an evil, destructive way. Sometimes doubt can be redemptive if it's leading us into deeper faith. Toxic doubt tends to be more narcissistic and bends in on itself. Toxic doubt loves to be the cynic and refuses to be the healer. Redeemed doubt, though, still has questions, but it endlessly moves beyond itself and looks for creative, life-giving ways to serve people with radical love. Redeemed doubt asks, what are the places of the world that Jesus is weeping over, and what would it look like for me to be his healing presence there? Isn't this what Jesus did with his disciples? In Matthew chapter 28, he took them up on a mountain. He had just resurrected from the dead, and he gathers them all together. He's like, okay, this is it. You've been in school long enough. Now it's time for you to go out. And there he is, the resurrected Lord, standing before them. And there's this fascinating line that I read for years, and I didn't even notice it till about 3 years ago. It said, some worshiped and some doubted. Can you imagine? Jesus is standing before you in his resurrected glory. Some worshiped and some doubted. If I were Jesus, I'd be like, you're done. Go home. Get some more schooling, whatever. The rest of you, I'll use you. But Jesus didn't do that. He sent out both the worshiper and the doubter. Those who had questions, those who had a faith that was a little more resolved. They were both vital to this revolution that he began. He sent them out. He sent out the doubter because no one showed more mercy to the doubter than Jesus. And that ragtag group of disciples, they went out and they turned the world upside down. And if Jesus did that with his disciples 2,000 years ago, if he sent out the doubter and the worshiper, the good news is he can do that with us in the midst of our doubts, in the midst of our pain, in the midst of our uncertainty, in the questions. He can redeem our doubt. And even when it feels like our faith is failing, Jesus never will. There's this old poem by a medieval poet. She wrote this: Christ has no body now but yours, no hands, no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the eyes through which he looks compassion on this world. Yours are the feet with which he walks to do good. Yours are the hands through which he blesses all the world. Yours are the hands, yours are the feet, yours are the eyes. You are his body. Christ has no body now on earth but yours.